If you've been here the last few weeks, you know that we've talked a lot about who this God is that showed up in our midst on the day that we now celebrate as that very first Christmas. We've talked about when, why, where, and how God showed up. And here's the thing, the first Christmas happened in what we might consider the worst possible time in human history. The worst possible time in human history, yet that's when God chose to show up. I mean, Paul, this is a few years after Jesus, Paul's writing to one of the churches that he had started, and he was writing to them, and in his talking to them, he says, "But when the fulfillment of time had come, or when the time was right, God sent His Son, born through a woman and born under the law." The right time and the right place for Him. But I tell you, it didn't make sense when you look at it. It doesn't make much sense because, first off, Mary and Joseph had to travel several days just to sign up to pay taxes. If they gave me that option, I would probably stay home, right? And what's worse is she's 9 months pregnant. Now, I've never been 9 months pregnant, but to travel several days on a donkey when you're 9 months pregnant, I don't think that's going to be the best of days, right? Yet God chose that time for them to take place. And what's worse, in the grand scheme of things, that is one of the lesser problems that they have, because you see, that first Christmas, Jesus was born under one of the most brutal empires in the history of the world. This guy that had called himself Augustus had declared himself the singular leader of the Roman Empire, and he declared himself to be a god, and in that he could not be challenged, and everyone was required to worship him. And so the attributes that were given to him, that people would talk about him, that Caesar Augustus, as it is, the one that had called for the census to be taken at the time that Jesus was born, they called him the Son of God, the bringer of peace. He was called the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And the very name he gave himself, Augustus, the meaning of that word is worthy of worship. With all of that going on, who Jesus really was on the night he was born was what Augustus, or Caesar Augustus, declared himself to be, what he wanted to be, what he ascribed to be, what his dream of being was. That's who Jesus was when he was born that night. So what that meant for Jesus Christ, the real Son of God, is that to be born into that setting, first off, was illegal by their rules, by His rules. And secondly, it was a literal death sentence for Him to be who He was. And yet that is the exact time that God chose for His Son to show up on earth. So when God chose, doesn't seem, well, kind of seems like the worst of times. And the first Christmas took place, I think, in what seems to be the worst possible place. I mean, let's start with the idea of having a baby in a barn out in the feed trough instead of any place cleaner in the whole world, right? Our clean little manger scenes that we do. You got clean hay, didn't you? Is not what their hay was going to be that night. But beyond that, he was not born into a royal family. I mean, he didn't have a mother and dad that was held in high esteem by his own people, by their peers, by their own family. And there was no connection to the good life at all. I mean, the things that we would think that the creator of the universe, the ones who created human beings, if they came to be in the midst of us, they would pick a place at a time, and especially a group that had some kind of good stuff going for them, right? And everyone in the nation was, at the very best, indentured servants and probably really were slaves. And so there's no way for this baby born, this Jesus Christ, to climb the ladder of success and to become the person that he needed to be to overcome this tyrannical, brutal, murdering emperor who called himself all the names that Jesus really was. And this first Christmas took place for what might seem to be the worst possible reason in the history of the universe. Now, I'm sure that you know the reason that Jesus was born into humanity. You know, even though Jesus, the second part of the triune God, has been in existence since forever, right? There is no beginning. But the reason Jesus was born and laid in a manger that first Christmas night was for what? It was for our redemption. And that sounds really great, and I promise you it is great. It's the greatest thing on the face of the earth since creation itself, and we started messing things up. The problem with it is that redemption has a price. The real reason God sent His Son to the earth in that place at that time was to die one of the most horrific deaths ever devised by humankind, and as a result, we get redeemed. But you know what? God's not looking for us to feel sorry for Him. And I'm not sharing these parts of this story tonight so that you'll feel sorry for Jesus and want to pat Him on the back or, come and pet the manger or whatever. That's not the reason. I'm sharing this story because we've been asked to respond to what God really did in the birth of Jesus Christ, of Him sending His Son to be in our midst. And here's the thing, we're asked to respond to God really only in one way. We're asked to make room for God in our lives. To make room. To make room. Seems to be a theme going here. To make room. Now I know that making room for Jesus, that idea didn't start very well in humanity, right? Because He was shoved out in the barn with the cows and the sheep. We didn't do very good to begin with. But since that night, people through the ages, for the last 2,000 years, people have made decisions to make room for Him and have followed through on making room in their busyness of their lives to take time to adore Him, to worship Him, and to follow His leading, to follow the leading of Jesus Christ. We're called to make room. The song that Zach and Margie sang just a few moments ago, some of you know this already, but this is the first night it's really been ever sung in public. And this is a song that Zach wrote the past few months. Just awesome song, Zach. And I want to share, I have a tendency to get caught up in the rhythm and the beats and the riffs you can put in there and all the little thingies between the words and all that. And so I want to read some of these words tonight because I want us to make sure that we get it. I think Zach got it right when he wrote this. I think God used Zach in this very much so. This is about making room. He says, on this dark and quiet night, we're waiting here for you. To come into this place, to come fill this room. Lord, come and fill this room. Well, we know you've been here before, searching for a place to stay, but all our space was spoken for. And so they laid you in the hay. Lord, we long for nothing else. You are the hope that we hold on to. So let us push aside even ourselves until there's nothing left but you. And then he concludes that with the chorus of this song, which in my mind, he gives us a challenge. He says, make room. Make room. Let the whole world see in you a place for the King. Remove any doubt of vacancy. Make room. Powerful words. So what would it mean for you to make room for Jesus Christ or for God in your life? I mean, if you don't really have, at this point, an intimate, personal relationship with God, I think that means inviting God to be a part of all you do. Just saying, come on. I think it means to visit with Him. You know, sometimes we call that prayer, but I think that gets a little formal sometimes. Sometimes we just visit. And sometimes I talk too much. But we just visit. Yeah, we call it prayer, but sometimes we talk, and then sometimes if we will just stop and listen, if we have this relationship with God, then God gives us direction for our lives. You see, everything God went through in giving us Christmas, everything God went through, He did just for one reason, and this is it. Forget everything else. This is the thing right here. Everything God went through to get to this place, He did it because He wanted to have a relationship with you. With you. Yeah. Can you imagine the creator of the universe and you hanging out? The King of Kings. I mean, the one that's mightier than the mighty. And you hanging out. The Lord of Lords, the one who has more power than the most powerful people in the world. And you hanging out. I love this one. The Prince of Peace. You know that one that when you have all this stuff going on in you and it's just ripping you apart, all the stress and stuff, and you finally, in your heart and your mind, finally just turn it over to God and you cry out to God, and God comes and just brings that peace that just surrounds you and hugs you tight, and you just saves your life. That Prince of Peace in you just hanging out. That's the reason God went through this and everything else. If you decide to respond to Christmas by being in personal relationship with Jesus Christ, it's the best decision you can make in your life. Let me tell you, I don't think it's a one-time decision. I think it's a decision we make daily. I think it's a decision that we make before we go to bed. It's a decision we make before we make big decisions. It's a decision we make before anything. We should include Him. But the question is this: won't you make room?